tuned for the Joan Quinn Profiles. As an editor for Andy Warhol's Interview, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, LA Style, and Detour magazines, Joan covered the social set, the Hollywood hotshots, the international art scene, the mysteries of food, the excitement of travel, and the fabulous world of fashion. Joan continues to find creative people on the cutting edge who make things happen. Here's Joan Quinn.
Hi, I'm Joan Quinn, and welcome to the Joan Quinn Profiles. Waiting to be profiled is filmmaker Paul Morrissey and artist Alysse Stepanian. Writer-director Paul Morrissey was born in New York City. He spent 8 years with the Sisters of Charity at St. Barnabas in the Bronx and 8 more years with the Jesuits at the Fordham Prep School and Fordham University. As Paul says, he's the ultimate card-carrying Catholic, and I say he's the ultimate bizarre filmmaker. He has been feted by film festivals all around the world. The most recent tributes were at the Kennedy Center in Washington and the American Film Institute. Several of his films are shown at each one of these institutes, and I think you'll remember them when we go through and talk about Flesh, Trash, and Heat. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Joan. Nice to see you.
You started in 1968 with Trash, and then 1970 with Heat.
Flesh,
Flesh
Trash,
in 1971.
Yeah.
And Little Joe D'Alessandro was in all of those films.
Right.
Were they written specifically for him, or did you already have the script and then find him?
No. I made up the story in my head, and I told the actors what they should talk about, and I knew the story and where it would go and what might happen, let's say, and where it would end. And I said, you say this, you say that, you say this, you say that, let's go. And I never used rehearsals or tried to do it over again.
On each one of those films?
Yes, those 3 I worked without any written script, but the material was in my head, and I'd...
That wasn't called a trilogy.
It wasn't. It just seemed to fall into that kind of... And it seems like after that I did 3 more films that were comparable one to the other.
When you started,
And after that I did 3 more films that were comparable. So, I mean, I think I take certain material and rework it in different formats. But it just seems to be a habit. It's not too conscientious.
When you left Fordham University, did you leave with the idea of being a filmmaker?
Not entirely, no, not exactly, because of nobody became filmmakers those days. It was a very odd thing. There was only still Hollywood, and there's very little independent filmmaking. I just bought a camera and loaded it and pushed the button and sent it off to the drugstore to get developed and wait to come back. It went to a little lab, and you came back, and it was in focus, and it was well exposed, and you considered yourself a filmmaker.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Did you ever think you'd be teaching when you left school? What were you going to do if this film didn't come back?
It's a good question. I never thought about it. I went to work at insurance companies, then one company, and then went on unemployment. To figure out what I might want to do. Then that ran out, then I went to work for the welfare department, giving out the welfare. And then that got me income for a while. And during that time I was buying film and shooting film. Then I went on unemployment.
Well, did all this Catholic upbringing put these kind of ideas in your mind?
Well, I don't think so at all, no.
It seems like they're totally the opposite of what you were probably taught in school.
Probably, but I think what they are a record of the period and the way things were happening to people and the characters. The tone of voice in the films, I think, really represents something that was the beginning of what we live under now, which is the total absence of morality, where morality really just fell off the table or disappeared down the toilet or something. And it was always interesting to me, especially with young people, how they are expected to get through situations, you want to call them life maybe, but just the average daily trivial situations, without any real background, no basis for their activity, and how empty their life is, and actually how foolish it is, and therefore very funny and maybe very human.
So what happened was, when you were doing Flesh, you were hearing about these situations going on?
Yes, I would say not. You know, you're vaguely aware of what's going on in the world. And the films, because they were so low budget and they were from a different place, they weren't from Hollywood, they were obviously, the logic was to do things that Hollywood would never do.
Right, and you were able to do it because you were an independent filmmaker at that point.
And the films cost so little. I mean, the reason Flesh was made is because everybody in the film were hired as, a lot of people in the film almost were hired as extras in Midnight Cowboy. And the notion was that there was finally a Hollywood film about street people and what's going on in the streets. And it was obvious that this was not really a terribly realistic movie. And it just seemed like if they're going to go into that subject matter, it would be a subject matter you could easily do better than they did with.
What about,
and so that was the impulse there.
Well, then what about Trash? Was that was a little
Flesh
different?
was a big success, so I decided to sort of make something similar. And Flesh was sort of about sex, Trash was about drugs. And then I did a third one, Heat, which was the main character was supposed to be a former rock and roller, or somebody who wanted to get into rock and roll. But by the time while I was making the film, I just didn't want to put any rock and roll in it, so I just left it out.
Oh, that's what it's so you had Joe D'Alessandro, the ultimate rock and roll look-alike,
right,
with
exactly.
no rock and roll.
Right, he had been a former child actor, and there was no work, he was unemployed, he wanted to form a rock group and get going again as a new act. And that was set in Hollywood in 1971, and it seemed to me a place where you go where nothing ever happens, where life is totally empty and nobody has any bearings. And it seemed to be very good material to chronicle this thing that people were beginning to live through, a life of total meaninglessness, the life of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which is the kind of ultimate punishment you can live under. And now it was happening then at the start, and I was recording, in effect, fringe people. Now I think the entire population has come around to that kind of shallow, empty kind of type of life, and kids are raised on sex and drugs and rock and roll.
So what was underground, out of the ordinary, off-keel has now become mainstream.
Mainstream, right in the schools. I mean, they give the kids in the second grade in New York condoms to get them going on the sex, to keep the sex going. And
to keep it going, to get it started.
They get the rock and roll from 6 months of age. They get kids humping one another on TV endlessly, 24 hours a day. So the kids are brought up with the concept that life is something you hump and something you take drugs to keep having my rock and roll.
But you made those films. Don't you feel that perhaps you were adding fuel to the fire of that time?
In effect, many people might say that, yeah. But you don't think like that at the time, and you think you're showing the foolishness of human behavior in a fringe situation. So, I mean, the context was really slightly different. Now, every television program is telling the kids when they should start having sex, or when what they should do about their sex, and they shouldn't frustrate anybody having sex. So, I mean, the material is now all absolutely mainstream on TV, sitcoms.
Right. When did you make your last film?
Spike of Bensonhurst was 88, and that was...
Spike of Bensonhurst. So if you went back now to make a film, what kind of film would you make? Would you make it against what's happening in
Well, it's not
what you were
against.
just talking
I don't
about?
make films for or against. I just think my take on them is a comical one. Therefore, I'm maybe reflecting the foolishness of this kind of life. I think that's as best you can do. But I'm not sure. I think it's still a very good subject. People trying to make a life, get a life. Well, I put it another way. It's sort of simple. If you play any kind of a sport, any game, and there are no rules, the game is not worth playing. So that's the way life is being lived today. There's no rules to life, and life is not worth living. And that predicament is foolish, it's comical, and interesting. And to show human beings under the pressure of living these empty lives seems to me, I think it's a subject that almost hardly any other filmmakers actually deal with.
So you would go back and continue.
I would see more there.
I mean, you did Woman in Revolt, Flesh for Frankenstein, Blood for
Dracula, Mixed Blood. But these are all versions of people attempting that kind of life, especially Frankenstein and Dracula were people who lived outside of conventional standards. But it was set in the 19th, early 20th century, so they were more traditional rebels. But Spike of Bensonhurst was an interesting film for me because I saw in the Italian-American community reaction against this contemporary life, a determined effort to hold back the tide, the flood tide of...
So was the Italian life in Bensonhurst, is that what you...
And it was very, very much a pro-mafia movie. I felt that the mafia might have a double standard. They might sell drugs outside the neighborhood, but they wouldn't allow it inside the neighborhood. And my theory there was better a double standard than no standard at all.
Then you made a film about Beethoven, Beethoven's nephew.
Well, Beethoven's nephew was something somebody in Europe asked me to do, and I jumped at it because I read the story. I didn't know anything about him. And he also lived outside of totally outside of conventional morality. He was the most asocial, antisocial, horrible human being I'd ever met in literature or biography. He was an unbelievable misanthrope and a hateful, awful human being.
One of the funny things I was reading...
But he was very sympathetic because he couldn't help being what he was. But he was miserable.
One of the interviews that you said was, that you gave was that he was so ugly that people didn't want to, I mean, that you didn't want to remember him looking like that, physically unattractive?
You couldn't actually categorize him or use him, characterize him, I mean, as he was. There are real good drawings of him in his last years, and one of the accounts of people who knew him, because he was very famous throughout his life, is in his last years when he went out in the street, the little kids ran after him and threw rocks at him.
He was
so hideous and ugly, and he was a monster. He was a little like a kind of evil Mr. Magoo. And what he tried to do was interesting because it's what people try to do today. He tried to make himself a life for himself. He took illegally a child of his brother who died. He made a deal with his brother, a legal contract saying the brother had a year to live from tuberculosis, and he said, I will give you enough money to live to the end of the year. Then that child is mine because your wife is a whore and she's a degenerate, and I must have this child. So he contradicted the document before he died, but he kept it in court for 6 years. He kept the child. He tried to be a parent to a child, and he couldn't. He was like a monstrous, awful person. So he tried to make a life in a situation of his own, and this boy just was so alienated that he tried to commit suicide.
Oh, is that right?
And he put 2 guns to his head, and both guns went through his forehead, but they didn't kill him, and he survived, and he actually put his uncle to death by leaving him in the rain for all night.
Oh, those stories, right.
And it's all true. His uncle, he really put his uncle to death by leaving him in a frozen building in the middle of winter after an all-night rainstorm. He was out in the rain, and he died of pneumonia that his nephew gave him.
I remember that. Then going from that horror story, because we're almost out of time, to Madame Wang's, which was made in Hollywood, actually.
Well, Hollywood, the story there was a person like a Beethoven, perhaps, another German.
Yes, that's what I was...
A communist agent comes to try to take over America because they had a lot of hopes of winning, especially during the Carter administration, of taking over the world. And that was their goal. So they had agents all over the world. So when he came here, he thought that he was going to establish, connections with Jane Fonda and all the activists here. And all he found were people who didn't care about anything. He found these old female impersonators, I call them overweight and over the hill female impersonators, who couldn't care if Russia took over anything. So he was so frustrated he goes back. So it seemed to me that California was like the breeding ground of people who just don't care about anything.
So it's in keeping.
They're all
I've
connected,
followed this
yes.
in keeping all the way through. And before we leave, I know you had a great connection with Andy Warhol. How did he fit in to the pattern of any of this?
Andy was a producer. He was trying to do things. He wasn't trying to do things. He wanted somebody to do things that would make him famous and to get his name more popular in the media, etc. So among the things it did was invent a rock and roll group and start a newspaper and make movies. But the movies were what I was mostly interested in. And the early way to get attention was to make experimental movies that were aggravating and annoying, and you dare people to sit through them.
Did you take a part of them?
And I was providing those experiments for years, but then after a certain point, those experiments seemed pointless because they had been done so much you couldn't do them again. So I just segued into narrative films. But Andy himself was not a verbal person. He was not an intellectual person. He was not a person who expressed himself in his thoughts in words. He had trouble talking. He was tongue-tied almost. And basically he was very happy if anything was done at all, because he was so, he was very positive, but yet he didn't have the wherewithal to do anything himself. So you did something for him, whatever it was, and he was very happy. And so he was the best kind of producer or entrepreneur you could work with. In the end result, it worked perfectly to his benefit because the name became so famous and the paintings became more valuable.
And we are the kind of people who are thankful when something gets done, and you came in and got this wonderful interview done.
Oh, I hope so.
Thank you very much, Paul Morrissey.
Thank you, Joan.
And thanks. Don't go away. Alysse Stepanian will be right back with us. Hi, I'm Joan Quinn, and we're back with painter Alysse Stepanian. Alysse was born in Tehran and came to the United States when she was 19 years old. She attended Rio Hondo Junior College and received her Bachelor of Fine Arts and her Master of Fine Arts from Cal State Long Beach. I get confused on these bachelors and masters and all of these degrees. Masters of Fine Arts is beyond a master's, is that right?
Yes, yes.
In what way?
Well, you have to take more classes to graduate and work harder. I think it was 30 units beyond the master's as Master's in Fine Arts.
Did you think you were going to teach? Is that why you were getting a master's?
No, not at all. I never really did have teaching in mind. I was more interested in the art, painting itself. Painting is my main thing.
Why did you choose Long Beach? Because they're so known for their video programs.
Well, they're actually known for their drawing and painting program too. They have a very strong fine arts department, excellent teachers.
Who were they? Who were your teachers?
Oh, well, some of the teachers that I worked with quite a bit were Tom Krompak and John DeHarris. They really helped me out to figure out what I really wanted from my art.
When you came to the United States, did you think you were going to be a painter when you were 19 years old?
Not right away. It took me a while.
Did it?
Yes.
Did you speak English when you came here?
I did, not too well. Took me a couple of years to be able to express myself clearly.
So was that in junior college at that time?
Yes, that's the time when I was taking all kinds of courses to figure out what I wanted. But I made my decision actually about 6 months after I came to the States.
Were there any artists in your family?
No.
So there was no influence from family background?
No, I was just one of those students at school that could always draw and paint better than everybody else.
And is that what you were doing all the time?
Well, I did it just as a hobby because I liked drawing. I never thought I could actually become an artist. Artists to me were in books, history books.
Who were your influences if you were going through history books and thinking about artists, something that was untouchable to you at the time? Whose work did you like?
Well, there were many.
Were there?
Yes, many. Some of them that I could think of right now were the older generation artists. Or 20th century, I could think of George Braque. I really liked his work. Some of the more romantic type of ideas that I had came from Vincent van Gogh. He's become so commercialized nowadays, but I read his book, his letters to his brother
Those
Theo.
were wonderful, weren't they?
Yes, and I was quite inspired by it, and I felt a lot of passion towards my own art, and it was a good book to read at the time.
So once you got into school, did you change? Did the influences change?
Oh yes, they're constantly changing.
They are even to this day?
Oh, even to this day, yes. There are a few contemporary artists that I really like seeing their work. After a while, you sort of just, figure out what you want, and you don't get influenced as drastically, but you still, respect your fellow artists.
Are you trying to figure out how they did something? Is that what happens in the process of looking at a person's art?
Not really how they did it, but just when I look at a painting, I look at, I guess at this time, I look at the plasticity of the paint itself, how it sits on the flat canvas. That's what I'm more attracted to, rather than the story that it's trying to tell.
Well, I was going to ask what your favorite media is. What kind of materials you like to use?
Well, oil on canvas is basically what I work on. I've been experimenting with painting on wood as well. I like the surface.
But these
are
the paintings we have on the set have the frames painted, so that's painting on wood. But are they collaged in any way?
Yes.
Explain this one behind us.
The one behind you actually started out with painting the stripes, and then there's a photo lithograph on there. The paisley leaves were printed on there, and there's a collage inside a figure, which I call the Golden Girl series. They're autobiographical. There's collages of interiors, and the same interior happens in the painting directly behind me.
Is that something that reoccurs in your mind? Is it an interior that you lived in? Because this one behind us, you can just about take this kind of like float through this painting and go from room to room, or see that the chairs are what I think are fabulous. There's chairs everywhere.
Yes, my paintings are mostly about interiors. I don't know why, but I have been doing...
Maybe you're a frustrated decorator.
Maybe. Who knows? I have been doing these other series called Biological Places, number 1 through, I think I've gone to number 12, and they're very small pieces, collages as well. Somebody told me that the interiors in my painting had a very special quality to them. They were mine, and maybe that's my biological place I'm trying to paint, and I think that's probably what it is.
Would you think this is, would you call it surreal?
There is a surreal quality in it, yes. Not as much in these ones that you're seeing, but in some other earlier, more figurative pieces.
So your work actually started out figurative, and then it kept moving. And if I understand what you're saying, it slowly but slowly became surreal and then biological in nature. I mean, different things coming in, and collage is not just paint. Do you see yourself going in another direction?
The direction I'm going to is I'm becoming more paint thoroughly. I'm enjoying just putting the paint down on that flat surface, experimenting with textures and colors. Not as interested in the story anymore. I think that the story, a painting does not have to tell a story. It's the visual effects that I'm really interested in.
Do you always paint in dark colors?
The earlier works, pieces were pretty dark, but my palette is changing now, becoming brighter too.
Is that because, do you think it's California that changes it, or
it could be. Somebody asked me that before, how come you don't use any bright colors? And I told this person because I wasn't used to bright colors in Iran, These antique colors were all I did back then, but they are changing now. It could be the California thing.
We talked earlier about getting a Master of Fine Arts, and I was thinking that a person goes that far because he would teach. Have you ever taught?
Oh, yes. I've taught kids as well as college level drawing classes, art classes. I did discover that I really enjoy teaching. When I teach, I review what I already know, and I learn
I see.
as I'm teaching.
I see.
And I get a lot of energy from my students.
Do you think a teacher or an educator in the field of art can be successful in both ways, being a successful person who shows in museums and galleries and also be a successful teacher? Do you think one pulls from the other?
Definitely, I do think so. I think if one had a secure teaching job, that would allow more time for painting.
Oh, it does. You
Because,
think so?
well, I mean, what else would an artist do?
Have these paintings been shown in galleries?
Yes, they have been. Actually, Sherry Frumkin in Santa Monica represents my work right now.
So when you came out of school, did you get a gallery right away?
Yes.
So you were very lucky.
I was
in
very
California or outside of California?
In California with Sherry, right after school.
And then, is your work been shown across the country? Does she have other galleries that she works with or museum shows?
No, she doesn't. I've been showing mainly in LA. I was in a group show in Korea once. So I have been in a lot of local, LA shows.
Where would we term you in response to painting? Would you still be called emerging? Or would you be
I don't know
midlife?
that. Maybe a lucky emerging artist. I don't know.
Because you're not midlife.
No.
How long have you painted?
Well, I've been studying this seriously for about 14 years.
But I mean,
But I've been out
now-
of school for 2 years, professionally practicing it through galleries.
So you would be emerging.
Right, I would assume so.
And this is very unusual for an emerging artist to have a gallery, to be established. And I've seen your name around town in many, many different venues.
Right, exactly. And I was also lucky to get a mural commission.
Oh,
I'll
tell
be
us
working on
about
that this summer. Yes.
Oh, great.
I'm starting this Friday, and I have 2 months to finish.
And what is it? Where is it?
It's in Hollywood. It's through SPARC, which is Social Public Art Resource Center.
Yes, I
You
know.
know?
That's wonderful.
Yes, and I'm going to be presenting the history of Armenians. I'm an Armenian, so I have the honor of doing the first mural.
Oh, and I'm an Armenian.
Oh.
And my mother's name was Stepanian. My mother's
No
maiden
kidding.
name. Yes.
Wow.
So I feel
You might be relatives.
Yes. When you do your figurative, I think you better include a former Stepanian in
Surely.
your. Thanks, Alysse, for being
Thank you
with
very
us.
much.
Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time on the Joan Quinn Profiles. Keep writing to 520 South Grand, 8th floor, Los Angeles, 971. Bye-bye.